Since we're going into sudden death over time, and this is the end of my life, if you can search through my posts and my history, you will find the things I say to be true. The untold story of NASA and the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Islands were rich with uranium. The biggest and most highest value uranium could be found in the Philippines. But the miners were dying. There was a serious problem. And I forbade certain mines to be mined as long as the miners were getting exposed and dying. And so I set up a small group of people to work on just dealing with making uranium survivable. A small military base was set up, and a group called NASA. National Institute for whatever. Anyway, I called it it was called NASA. And they were developing suits and radiation shielding to make the mines safe, as in even mine vehicles that could go into the mines and mine the uranium safely and protect the workers from the intense radioactive effects of the radiation. So they've developed suits and all kinds of things. Meanwhile, the Philippine president decided to start mining things on the side. He decided that they would do mining of the less radioactive uranium, which turned out to be still very, 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 very fatal. And in fact, their workers were so heavily irradiated that they could actually kill 1% of the population. In other words, one of these workers walking through a market would literally walk up to next to someone and they would literally convulse and die. About 1% to 10% of the Philippine population was basically almost immune to radioactive effects, it seems. Or it seemed. Within 1 to 25 year periods, these workers would be heavily irradiated and have no outward effects of having had radiation exposure, other than tick, 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 tick. But these people could walk up to unsuspecting bystanders and basically kill them by just standing next to them. About 1 to 5% of the population is hyper allergic to radiation. In other words, they die easily. You can never. I don't know. I was having genetics look at why this was exactly, why some people were so affected by radiation and other people weren't. Other people could be heavily irradiated for about 25 years and then they would get cancer and die or something like that. About 1 year was the quickest turnaround for the Filipino miners. Now, NASA was a small group that I was paying for and basically leading, out of an American military base. It was a military organization at first and was developing the radiation shielding for the suits as well as other radiation, by taking intense radiation sources and basically just seeing what a mouse could take. They'd put a mouse next to it and then they would try different samples to see what would kill the mice and what wouldn't. And then they would know basically what kind of what shielding was best. And so they developed suits for this and were used inside 1 to 3 mines that were American mines in the Philippines. And those mines were mine. America's. Anyway, and I was overseeing them, and some of them were really bad, and the radiation was found in all of them. And this goes in, if you see my what's called channel, my Facebook page. It goes into how radiation was being found, and radiation, when the soldiers say things were heating up in the Philippines, that really means that things were becoming radioactive, as in, because uranium, when you put a lot of it next to each other, it would just seemingly heat up. Like you could walk up to the containers that held the uranium ore and put your hand up against them, and they would actually be noticeably warm in winter, or warm. No one knew why. No one knew what it was until one person actually mentioned that they couldn't use radios near the uranium dumps or uranium transport container. And that was when I was like, oh, so they are giving off something that we can't see. And then I did, and then I tasked the NASA group with basically developing shielding and blah blah. And people started dying in the Philippines like crazy, and people started dying at white scale or wind scale. It was originally called white scale, I believe, and then it was changed to wind scale, and then it was changed again. I think it was white scale at first. Just like Newcastle was originally some other town, and then I had it renamed to Newcastle because I thought it looked sounded better, and besides, it was basically taken over and used as a uranium transport train to white scale. And all the uranium would go in and out of this port, and everyone would be protected from the containers which held uranium because they were highly dangerous containers, which were originally shipped in just open mine carts. And then later on, they were, that they would wet down on the top. And they had to keep wetting them down, otherwise they would literally heat up and basically burst into flames. Because when you hauled more than a 40 by 40 foot train car of them, they literally did melt the train car. In fact, there were a couple of fires where the mine cars actually caught on fire and actually melted at the side of the road. I believe it was very, 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 very hard to transport. And I think I suggested using like lots of connecting cars to keep the steam train engine separate from the mining cars, which were way in the back. To shield the operators by distance, and also having metal plating on the very back of the steam engines to keep, the radiation from coming forward and irradiating my drivers at the time. Or at least that's what I ordered, and I believe it was done. Anyway, but NASA developed radiation suits that could actually withstand fairly high radioactive sources and actually not expose the wearer to any radiation at all. So. And they pioneered it in the Philippines, which became basically a radioactive wasteland, and pretty much I pulled my people out. But then they cleaned it up, and my NASA group could only supply like 3 or 4 mines, but some of the suits were given away free to some of the other mine workers, which the Filipino president did not consider a worthwhile effort to do. He saw the suits as being too expensive to be manufactured for his workers. So he decided to not tell his workers or whatever until they started having over 250,000 of the Philippine residents were affected, and some of them were heavily radioactive, and that goes into the whole how they were saying people were being arrested. They weren't being arrested; they were being quarantined as being heavily radioactive. If you go to the Philippines, you might know some old people that might talk about there weren't arrests. It was a fact that these people could kill people just by standing next to them. And these people were terminal. They would only have lasted 5 to 25 years anyway. And they also kind of did help with the white scale cleanup and other things in white scale as well, because they were already going to die. And I said, no, you can have the suit anyway, but a lot of them chose not to have the suit. And it was like, so a lot of them died in a year. About 250,000 people were affected, Filipinos mostly, and of course I believe that the American government ran 3 mines which had suits and protective gear, and protected mining equipment as well, and I believe it was painted white to distinguish it from other construction equipment, because this equipment had special shielding, and that kind of goes into the whole NASA thing. And also they had NASA badges on them or something like that, which told them that they weren't just bulky clothing, that they were a radiation suit. And it would actually protect the wearer from basically, you could pretty much stand inside a reaction chamber and basically be like, that's nice. With the little radiation going bing, 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 bing all over you. And they developed plastic that was actually radiation proof too. So you could actually have this plastic dome in front of you. It scratched really easily, but it would actually stop the radiation, or at least only like one layer of it would become heavily radioactive, and the radiation would actually stop and wouldn't penetrate to the inner layers of the plastic, which is the key thing behind the NASA suits and why they're so unique and also very expensive. And they started out in the Philippine Islands as one little military base developing radiation shielding. And I know this because I tasked them. So, and I was just a child back then. But I was like, and I want you to do that. Anyway, but that's the truth of it. Uranium and the Philippine Islands and the untold story of how NASA started there.